Fate only binds you if you let it.
God of War Ragnarok has a lengthy story and a ton of beautiful and violent realms to explore, but just quite how long is it? Here, we'll let you know exactly how many hours it took different members of the IGN team to finish the game, and what they prioritised doing with that time.
It took me around 28 hours to reach the end of God of War Ragnarok's story. Along that journey, I completed a fair few of the longer side quests though, so I'd estimate somewhere in the early 20s if you were going to go straight ahead along the path of mainlining it. It's crucial to note that there isn't a point of no return in Ragnarok, so every objective is still available to complete after the credits have rolled. Since then, I've put another 20 hours in and have secured that platinum trophy. That includes beating all of the really tough optional bosses and cleaning up all of the collectible ravens, artifacts and lore, of which some were quite difficult to find, but that shouldn't be too much of an issue for you now that guides will be available at launch. I still haven't got 100% in every realm however, so I'm still finding myself jumping back into Ragnarok for the odd side quest or two.
My playthrough of God of War Ragnarok took about 34 hours. I played pretty intuitively for the first half, only following side quests and alternate paths when it seemed truly interesting. As the narrative started to reach its conclusion, I mainlined the story pretty heavily, despite Atreus often telling me to slow down and do some side content. If I didn't have to finish my playthrough for work, it would have taken me about 50 hours easily, and I still don't know if I'd be done at that point. Atreus and Mimir are in charge of the game's pacing, and they are good at reminding you there's a lot to be done other than the main story. But it can be hard to listen when you just need answers. God of War Ragnarok's story is fantastic, but some of the side content contains the best stories and battles the world has to offer, so don't be afraid to take your time. Your journey will be richer for it.
So, I rolled credits around the 60-hour mark on the Give Me God of War difficulty with a 95% completion. Yes, there were a few optional fights that took me more tries than I'd like to admit, especially early on when you're limited by lower level gear, but a good chunk of my clock came from restarting fights to record that perfect no-hit encounter, or just practicing blocking and dodging so I could learn enemy mechanics and the timing for parrying their most troublesome attacks to write tips for our guides. Chances are, if you're reading our wiki, you're reading some of my tips. I spent way more time than I should have when backtracking to try and find some random, undiscovered objective. This was my biggest gripe with God of War Ragnarok, is that particular objectives or collectibles aren't locked behind equipment, some are, but instead they're locked behind a conversation with a character in a future chapter, with some of them not being available until completing the main story, despite showing up on the objectives list. If I were to start fresh now, knowing not to go for that 100% completion before rolling credits similar to what I did in God of War 2018, I would have cut my run in half. So consider this your PSA.
You could have told me before I poured.
It took me about 42 hours to do everything I could in the game before the final sequence of the story, and then I got a final playtime of about 44 hours on the Gimme Balance mode. Anytime there's a game with collectibles and unlockable weapons or armor, I make sure to get it all before the ending of the story. In God of War Ragnarok's case, that meant backtracking through all the realms with newly acquired abilities to tick off all the items on the collectible checklist.
Back to smashing through things for fun and profit.
Some of it was still fun and exciting, while others not so much. I highly recommend fully clearing Alfheim before finishing that arc if you're also a completionist type. And now there's all these post-story things to collect. I can't wait.
By the time I rolled credits on my Give Me No Mercy playthrough of God of War Ragnarok, my playtime clocked in at about 38 hours. That includes about 20 side quests and a lot of exploration of all the 9 realms. My playstyle in the first 3 quarters of the game was to complete every side quest that I could reasonably handle at my level, but once I reached the last quarter, I decided to save the rest for the post-game, and luckily for me, the post-game seems pretty stacked. I still have 14 quests in my journal that I have not yet completed, and several challenges that I'm simply not well equipped enough to handle just yet.
I blasted through the story of God of War Ragnarok in just over 26 hours and made a solid but partially failed attempt to avoid any side missions as I went. It's incredibly easy to get distracted in God of War Ragnarok, but after witnessing a handful of Metroidvania like you can't do this until you have this areas, I made the decision to focus purely on the story and mop up everything else after the journey was complete. I'm glad I did, because exploring the 9 realms, story quests and endgame content almost felt like another full game worth of God of War goodness. There's a ton to see and do, and it's not all related to quests either. With all the tools now in my arsenal, I clocked in another 21 hours in that quest for the precious platinum, which finally popped on hour 47. And if you want more on God of War Ragnarok, why not check out our review or graphics comparison? And for everything else Kratos and his crew, stick with IGN.